Okay, well, welcome to the second lecture. If you haven't already reviewed the first lecture, I'll definitely encourage you to do so. And I'll also encourage you to follow the lectures in sequence the first time you view them. We'll be constantly building on the previous lecture's content, and you might get confused if you don't follow a sequential approach. So in this lecture, as you probably guessed, we'll be talking about stakeholders. We've been throwing around the term stakeholder quite a bit. That's a general term for everyone and anyone that is impacted by the requirements in some way. But if we just think of stakeholders in a general sense, we'll run into problems later. So let's take a look at some of the actual types of stakeholders on everyday projects. First off, yes, you, as a business analyst, are a stakeholder. How are you impacted by the requirements? Well, probably more than anyone. You're responsible for gathering them, for analyzing them, for writing them, for modeling them, etc. When a requirement changes, you need to manage it. And it's not necessarily just you. If you are part of a larger team of business analysts working on a project, then you are all requirement stakeholders. The next group of stakeholders is the larger project team. Let's look at some of the most common types of project team members and see how they're impacted by requirements. First, we have the PM, or the project manager. Each project has one, and the project is their overall responsibility. Project managers are responsible for guiding a project to completion within whatever constraints the project is under. And those constraints are typically a budget, or a deadline, or a minimum level of product quality, etc., etc. Requirements are usually defined at the beginning of a project, and they have a significant impact on how the project goes. If requirements are poorly defined at the beginning, the project will be in trouble later, and so that impacts the PM quite a lot. Projects also have implementation teams. For software projects, they are the development team. For business process projects, it could be an operations team, perhaps, that handles implementation. Whatever the case, we business analysts tend to think of implementation teams as the primary consumer of our requirements. And this is appropriate, but just remember that they're not the only consumers of our requirements. How are they impacted by requirements? Well, most importantly, the requirements specify the work that the implementation team has to do. It's really important to implementers that the requirements be accurate to the actual need of the organization. Otherwise, the implementation team will build the wrong solution. Similarly, changes to requirements often cause the implementation team to have to do significant extra work later on. Another common team on the project are the QA, or testing professionals. They're responsible for assuring the overall quality of the project deliverables. On a software project, and I'm going to stick with software projects for the time being because they're probably the most common type of project we work on. On a software project, they test the software for bugs. But bugs, or defects as we usually call them, they're defined as how the actual solution developed differs from the requirements. So QA and testing professionals are very important stakeholders also. If requirements are missed or poorly defined, QA is substantially impacted. Now, these three categories of stakeholders, the project manager, the implementation team, and the QA team, they're pretty much the basic template for any project. But every project is unique, and the people and roles on a project change for many projects. I'm sure you'll be able to think of additional requirement stakeholders on projects that you're working on. Away from the core team, who else do we have as stakeholders? Well, the first that should come to mind are our management. We generally don't develop requirements or run projects for fun. We do them to achieve a business need. And since management is on the hook to achieve those business needs, they're an important bunch of stakeholders for us. I think it goes without saying that your boss is a requirement stakeholder on virtually every project you work on. Why? Because they're your boss. If they're happy with you, you'll benefit. If they're not happy with you, well, you won't. Your boss is judged partly by the quality of your work, and so that makes them a stakeholder. Sometimes, particularly in more hierarchical organizations, the same will go for your boss's boss, and sometimes their boss. I'd say get to know your organization and get some input from your manager, and you'll be able to figure out who those key players are. But it's not just your own direct line management. Does your project manager have a boss? then they're probably a stakeholder too. For example, if a project is running late or is otherwise challenged, the boss of the PM is often the first person to get a call from an executive or from a customer, and that makes them impacted by the requirements and therefore a stakeholder. The same goes for the manager of the implementation team, for the manager of the QA team. Often there are additional management stakeholders. Again, get input from your boss and the other project team members to figure out who that right list of stakeholders is. Next up is just kind of an other category, and the first one is a very special type of stakeholder, and that's the sponsor. When we say sponsor, we generally mean the person that has the business ownership of the project. They are usually quite highly ranked in the organization, and they're responsible for ensuring the delivery of the project to senior management. The sponsor is really a key relationship for the business analyst, and I'll encourage you to take extra special care of them. Another important group of stakeholders are internal users. These are the people who will be using the system or process or whatever that you're developing. Internal users are a great source of input for business analysts. They're also the people that are usually most impacted by the final product. Since requirements quality has such a big impact on that final product, consider internal users to be a key stakeholder group. And the last group of stakeholders we'll discuss is probably the biggest and by far the most important, your customers. And here I'm not talking about your internal customers, the sales team or whatever. No, I'm talking about the actual customers that pay your company money for products and services. On every project, ask yourself how your customers will be impacted. Sometimes they won't be. Maybe you're working on a new report for management or something like that. But usually, one way or another, they will be impacted. Really bad things happen to a company when customers aren't considered during projects. Even more so, is the customer the end user of your product? Then you really need to pay attention to what your customers want, what they need, and what they do with respect to your product. Okay, so this is a little overview of who the most common stakeholders are, and we need to understand their interests so that we can work with them most effectively. Always remember that each project is unique, and you'll usually have a different list of stakeholders, which actually brings me to the next point. Make a list of them. First, at the beginning of the project, first thing you do, make a list of all your known or probable stakeholders, and try to figure out how they need to be included in the project. Stick that list of stakeholders in a section of your requirements document or on a spreadsheet that'll be commonly reviewed and updated, and validate that list. Remember to keep it updated. Why bother to do all this? Well, for a number of reasons. First, because you'll end up needing to meet with those stakeholders to understand their needs. Additionally, they'll need to review and give input on your requirements. They'll also need to be involved in approvals and testing and all kinds of other stuff. Your stakeholders are your best friends, and it's helpful to have a list of them, just like on Facebook.